The morning I understood that God had been preparing me for something I could not yet see. I was standing at the welcome table at Mount Calvary AME Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, in my best navy dress, handing out bulletins with both hands and a smile that had taken me 43 years to earn. Not because I was performing happiness. I want to be clear about that from the very beginning. The smile was real. The peace behind it was real. But what most people in that sanctuary did not know, what I had not told a single soul except my daughter Imani and my prayer partner Sister Ruth, was that exactly 2 years before that Sunday morning, I had been sitting in the parking lot of that same church in my car, in the dark, at 11:30 at night, asking God whether I had anything left to give. 2 years, 24 months. Some of the most difficult and most clarifying months of my entire life. My name is Denise Lorraine Caldwell Morris. I am 47 years old. I am a woman who was raised in the church the way some people are raised in a language. Not just attending it, but breathing it, thinking in it, organizing the whole interior of herself around its rhythms and its promises. My grandmother, Mama Eula, gave her life to Greater Faith Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama for 61 years. My mother, Claudette, served on the trustee board of our family church in Atlanta for 22 years. I grew up understanding that the church was not just a building you went to on Sundays. It was the place where your family held its history, where your grief was witnessed and your joy was celebrated, and where the community of people who had known you since before you could walk held you accountable to becoming the person God intended. I believed in all of that with my whole heart. And then I watched the people I trusted most inside that community use the very structures I had given my life to in order to take something from me that I had spent decades building. This is the story of what they took, and what I built from what remained. Stay with me, because I am not telling you this story for the sympathy of it. I am telling you because I know there is a woman somewhere, maybe sitting in her car right now, or in her kitchen at 5 in the morning when the house is quiet and the grief is loudest, or in a church pew trying to hold herself together while the music plays, who needs to hear that the betrayal was not the end of her story. It was the turning point. It was the place where God finally had her full attention. Let me take you back to the beginning, because this story, like all the stories that matter, did not start with the betrayal. It started with the love. I came to Mount Calvary AME Church 15 years ago, when my marriage to Raymond Morris ended, and I packed 2 suitcases and my 11-year-old daughter into a Honda Accord and drove 5 hours north to start over in a city where my cousin Brenda had a spare bedroom and a job lead at the hospital administration office where she worked. I was 32 years old. I had a degree in business administration that I had completed while working full-time and raising Imani, a failed marriage that had cost me my savings and my confidence in roughly equal measure, and a faith that I was holding on to the way you hold on to something in moving water. Not gracefully, not comfortably, but with the specific desperate grip of someone who knows that letting go means going under. Cousin Brenda took me to Mount Calvary the first Sunday after I arrived. The church was a mid-sized congregation, about 300 members, in a neighborhood that was in the middle of one of those transitions that American cities go through, where old families and new development were negotiating the same blocks. The building was a white-painted brick structure with a deep red door and a stained glass window above the entrance that showed the resurrection morning in colors so saturated they looked like they were lit from inside even on cloudy days. When I walked through that red door for the first time with Imani's hand in mine, the choir was already singing, and the sound, a full choir doing a traditional AME arrangement of "The Lord Will Make a Way Somehow," reached into my chest and did something that I can only describe as a rearranging, like furniture being moved to let the light in. I sat down in a pew in the 3rd row from the back, and I cried for about 4 minutes, which Brenda handled with the grace of a woman who had expected exactly this, pressing a tissue into my hand without comment and putting her arm around my shoulders. I felt for the first time in a long time that I was somewhere I was supposed to be. The pastor of Mount Calvary was Reverend Harold James Beaumont, 61 years old at the time, a compact man with close-cropped silver hair, and the kind of voice that did not need to be raised to fill a room. He had been at Mount Calvary for 19 years, and he had the particular authority of a pastor who had been through enough with a congregation to have earned their trust the hard way. Not just through the good Sundays, but through the hospital visits and the funerals and the Sunday mornings when the offering was down and the building needed a roof and the sermon still had to be preached and preached well. I respected him immediately. I trusted him within a year. The other central figure in this story is a woman named Patricia Ann Graves, Sister Patricia. She was 50 at the time I arrived, a tall, elegant black woman with natural hair that she wore in elaborate twists, an accountant by profession, and the chair of the Mount Calvary Financial Stewardship Ministry. She was also, within 6 months of my joining the church, my closest friend. I want to tell you about Patricia the way she was before I tell you about what she did, because the betrayal only makes sense if you understand what I believed we were to each other. She was the first person at Mount Calvary who saw me. Not as Brenda's cousin, not as the divorced woman who had just arrived, but as Denise, specifically, with her specific gifts and her specific potential. She came to me after a business meeting in my 3rd month at the church, where I had asked a question about the ministry's budget presentation that apparently revealed a level of financial literacy she had not expected, and she said, "Sister Denise, I think you might be exactly who this stewardship team needs." She said it simply, without flattery, the way women say things when they mean them. I joined the stewardship team the following month. Within 2 years, I was Patricia's second in command. Within 5 years, the two of us together had restructured the church's budget presentation process, introduced a new accounting software system, secured a small nonprofit grant for the youth ministry, and cut the building maintenance cost by 18% through a vendor renegotiation that Patricia had strategized and I had executed. Pastor Beaumont called us his dynamic duo from the pulpit one Sunday, and the congregation laughed warmly, and I remember looking over at Patricia and feeling a specific kind of pride that is not about accomplishment, but about partnership. The pride of being known as someone who does good work alongside someone else who does good work. She was my friend. She was my mentor. She was in my home for Sunday dinners. She held Imani's hand at her high school graduation. She sat with me in the waiting room at the hospital the night my mother had her first stroke. I loved Patricia Graves the way you love the people who show up for the specific chapters of your life that require someone to show up. I want you to hold that picture, because what I'm about to tell you is going to require you to remember it. My life at Mount Calvary deepened over those 15 years in ways that I had not anticipated when I walked through that red door with my suitcase still in Brenda's spare bedroom. I found my footing professionally, moving from hospital administration into healthcare finance, eventually becoming a revenue cycle manager at a regional medical center, a position that used every skill in my business degree and required me to develop 3 times as many more. I built a home of my own, a 3-bedroom house 12 minutes from the church that I bought alone, with my own income and my own credit in my 42nd year. And I will tell you that the morning I got the keys, I stood in the empty living room, and I wept, and I said thank you out loud to no one in the room and to someone who was in every room. Imani graduated from college, became a social worker, and moved to an apartment 20 minutes away, close enough for Sunday dinner and far enough for her to be fully and proudly herself. And at Mount Calvary, I grew into a role that had become as central to my identity as anything else in my life. I was, by my 13th year at the church, the co-chair of the stewardship ministry with Patricia, a trustee, a mentor in the women's ministry, and, in what felt like the fullest expression of all of it, the person who had been quietly asked by Pastor Beaumont to begin preparing for a larger leadership role that he was planning to create. A director of church operations position that would formalize and expand the administrative infrastructure work that Patricia and I had been doing, informally for years. He told me about it in his office on a Thursday afternoon in early November, in the 12th year of my membership. He said, "Denise, I believe God has been preparing you for something larger in this house, and I believe the time is coming when this church needs someone with your gifts in a formal leadership capacity." He said it with the directness of a man who had been watching someone for a long time and had reached a conclusion. I drove home that evening, feeling something I can only describe as alignment. The feeling of your life moving in the direction it was always meant to move, the feeling of work and faith and community and purpose, all pointing in the same direction at the same time. 3 months later, the bottom fell out. I want to tell you precisely how I found out, because the how matters, not just as a detail, but as a lesson in the particular way that betrayal comes to you in institutional settings. Not with a dramatic confrontation, not with a revelation scene like something from a movie, but in the most mundane possible way, through a document that was not meant for your eyes. It was a Tuesday in February. I had come to the church office after work to pick up documentation I needed for the grant application we were submitting for the food pantry expansion. The church's administrative assistant, a young woman named Tamara, was on the phone when I arrived and pointed to the front desk, where she had set things out for several people who would be coming by that afternoon. There was a stack of envelopes and folders. Nothing labeled on the outside, just a stack of items waiting for their owners. I found the folder with the grant documents on top and gathered everything in the spot she had pointed to, assuming the small stack of papers clipped to the back of my folder were additional materials she had pulled for my use. It was an honest mistake on both our parts. She had placed Patricia's working documents directly behind my folder without separating them clearly, assuming that Patricia, who was expected earlier, had already come and gone. I assumed the extra papers were for me. Neither of us realized the error until it was too late to matter. I did not discover it until I got home and sat down at my kitchen table to go through everything. Clipped behind my grant documents was a set of handwritten working notes, 5 pages, dense with bullet points and margin annotations, that I recognized as Patricia's handwriting immediately. She had a particular way of writing in burgundy ink that I had seen on hundreds of documents over 12 years. They were notes from a leadership subcommittee meeting I had not known existed. Dated 6 weeks earlier. The meeting had been called by Patricia. The attendees were 3 of the 5 trustees, the chair of the personnel committee, and the associate pastor, Reverend Yvonne Tate, a woman who had joined Mount Calvary 4 years earlier and whom I had, without reservation, welcomed, supported, and advocated for. These were not formal minutes. They were Patricia's own working notes from the meeting, personal, unfiltered, written in the shorthand of a woman recording her own thinking rather than a public record. And because they were personal notes rather than institutional documentation, they were more candid than any formal record would ever have been. The subject of the meeting, as recorded in those notes, was the Director of Church Operations position. Specifically, why Denise Morris should not be appointed to it. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, long enough that the room got dark around me and I had not turned on a light. I read those notes twice, slowly, the second time, because the first reading had been in the particular stunned way that you read something you are not yet allowing yourself to fully believe. The notes were detailed. Patricia had written her own characterization of my leadership style as occasionally difficult to manage in collaborative settings. She had listed concerns, vague, unsubstantiated, with no specific examples recorded, about my interpersonal approach with certain ministry teams. She had noted the subcommittee's discussion about the possibility of creating the Director of Operations role with a modified scope that would make it more suitable for, and here was the line that I have returned to more times than I can count in the years since, someone with what she wrote as a more naturally deferential temperament. Beside that phrase, in the margin, she had written a name, Reverend Yvonne Tate. I closed the folder. I got up from the table and I walked to the kitchen and I stood at the sink in the dark for a while. Then I went to my bedroom and I knelt down beside the bed. Not in a performed way, but in the actual collapse of a woman whose knees have stopped working as knees and are now only good for the position of prayer. And I said, Lord, I don't know what to do with this. That was all I had, but it was enough. Because that is where the story turns. Let me tell you what I did not do. I did not march into the church the next morning and throw those notes on Patricia's desk. I did not call any of the trustees whose names appeared in those pages. I did not say a word to Pastor Beaumont before I had done what I needed to do inside myself, which was something that took longer and required more than the righteous outrage that was available to me in that first week, and that I had to be very careful not to let run the situation. What I did instead, in the first 3 days, was go very quiet. I went to work. I came home. I cooked dinner for myself. I called Imani and did not tell her what had happened. Not because I was protecting her, but because I needed to understand it myself before I could speak about it to anyone. I sat in my house that I had bought with my own hands, and I thought about 15 years. About what I had built, and what I had trusted, and what I had not been watching carefully enough because I was too busy being grateful for it. On the 4th day, I called Sister Ruth. Sister Ruth Patterson is 72 years old, and she's been my prayer partner at Mount Calvary for 9 years. She is a retired high school principal, a woman of remarkable stillness, and the person I have chosen in my life to be the keeper of my most honest prayers, the ones that are not yet ready to be public, the ones that still have too much anger in them to be safe anywhere else. I called her and I told her everything. I described the contents of those notes over the phone. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for about 15 seconds. Then she said, "Denise, what does the Lord require of you in this moment? Not, who do we call? Not, what are we going to do about Patricia? Not, have you thought about the implications?" Just that one question, which was the right question, and which I was not yet ready to answer. I said, "I don't know yet." She said, "Then pray until you know. Don't move until you know." I prayed for 2 weeks. I want to be honest about what that looked like, because when people say they prayed about something, it can sound very serene and composed, and I want you to know that mine was not serene or composed. It was 2 weeks of very early mornings in the kitchen, with my Bible open, and sometimes arguing with God, and some evenings driving to the church parking lot just to sit in the dark outside the building and ask whether what I had given this community had been real, or whether I had been a fool. And some nights lying in bed, running the timeline of 15 years over and over, finding the moments I had missed and the places I had not looked because I was not looking for betrayal from that. Direction. And somewhere in those 2 weeks, I cannot tell you the precise night, only that it was late, and I was tired in the particular way that you get tired when you have been carrying something heavy for long enough. Something shifted. I stopped asking why Patricia had done it, and I started asking what I was going to do with what I now knew. Those are 2 completely different questions. The first one keeps you in the wound. The second one starts the work. I went to Pastor Beaumont on a Monday morning. I made an appointment through Tamara, who did not know that the documents she had accidentally sent home with me had reoriented the entire direction of my life. I sat across his desk and I placed the notes on the surface between us. I said, "Pastor, I believe these came to me by mistake. They are Sister Patricia's working notes, and they were given to me in error when I came to pick up the grant documents last week. I am bringing them to you because they contain information about a process that directly involves me and that I was not aware existed, and I think you need to know that I have seen them." He looked at the notes. He did not touch them immediately. He looked at me. I want to tell you what Pastor Beaumont's face did in that moment, because it told me something important. It did not show surprise. It showed the specific, careful composure of a man who is receiving a confirmation that is more complete and more organized than what he had previously understood, which meant that what Patricia had done in that room with those trustees and with Reverend Tate was not something he had been aware of in its full form. He said, "Denise, I owe you a direct conversation, and I apologize that it is happening in these circumstances rather than the ones I intended." He told me that Patricia had come to him directly several months earlier, before any subcommittee, and had raised informal concerns about the Director of Operations appointment. He said he had listened and had told her plainly that his assessment of my readiness for that role had not changed. He had believed that conversation had resolved the matter. He had not known that Patricia had subsequently organized a subcommittee meeting and put her campaign into a structured format that excluded him. He said, "She took a conversation I believed was closed and moved it into a room I was not in. I failed to follow up. I failed to ensure she understood that my position was final, and I failed to protect you from a process that should never have been allowed to develop the way it did. He paused. I am sorry, Denise. I want to tell you about the specific experience of receiving a genuine apology from someone in pastoral authority, because it is rarer than it should be, and it matters more than people acknowledge. He did not qualify it. He did not distribute the blame across the situation or invite me to consider Patricia's perspective or suggest that there were two sides. He said he had failed me and he was sorry, and I could hear that he meant both of those things. I said, I appreciate that, Pastor, and I need you to know that I'm not coming to you to ask you to take action on my behalf. I am coming to you because you needed to know that I know, and because what I do next should not happen without your awareness. He said, What are you going to do next? I said, I'm going to speak to Patricia directly, and then I am going to decide what my future at this church looks like. Because I have not decided that yet, and I want to be honest with you about that uncertainty. He nodded. He said, Whatever you decide, I want you to know that my assessment of your gifts has not changed and will not change. I believed him. That mattered. Not because his belief was the foundation of my identity. I was past the point in my life where I needed a pastor or anyone else to validate what I knew about myself. But because it was true, and because truth, offered cleanly and without agenda, is one of the ways that God holds you while you are finding your footing. I walked out of his office and I sat in my car and I said one of my honest, unpolished prayers. I said, Lord, I don't know what this community is to me anymore. I don't know what I am building here or whether it is still worth building. I need you to be clear with me because I am not clear right now. And I need you to be with me for what I have to do next. Then I drove to Patricia Graves's house. She opened the door in a Saturday afternoon casual dress, her glasses on, a book in her hand, and her expression did the thing that expressions do when they encounter something unexpected. It reorganized quickly into something more careful than it had been a second before. I did not raise my voice. I want to be clear about that. Not because I was not angry, I was, but because I had made a decision in those 2 weeks of prayer that the way I moved through this situation was going to reflect who I was and not who the situation was trying to make me. I had watched women, in churches, in workplaces, in families, lose the narrative of their own stories because the rightness of their anger had become louder than the rightness of their position. I was not going to do that. I said, Patricia, I think we need to talk, and I think you know why. I will not give you the full transcript of that conversation because some of it belongs only to that doorway and those two women and God who was listening. What I will tell you is the essential shape of it. She did not deny it. I have thought about this since, and I think it would have been worse in some ways if she had, because denial would have meant contempt, and what she showed instead was something more complicated and more painful, which was guilt that had been living alongside intention for long enough that neither one had won. She said that she had believed, genuinely, that she was acting in the church's best interest, that she had concerns about my leadership, real concerns, she insisted, though she could not give me examples that held up under the direct examination I gave them, and that she had made a choice to address those concerns in a way that she now acknowledged had been wrong. She said she had not wanted to hurt me. She said she had convinced herself that redirecting the process was somehow different from acting against me directly. She said she did not know I would find out the way I found out. I said, Patricia, I need you to hear me say something, and I need you to let it land without responding to it immediately. She nodded. I said, whatever you believed about my leadership, the right response was a direct conversation with me. Not a subcommittee. Not a meeting I was excluded from. Not a campaign to redirect an opportunity that my pastor had already identified for me. That was not about the church. That was about you, and about something between you and me that you chose to handle in the dark instead of in the light. And I need you to sit with what that means. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, You're right. 2 words. They did not undo anything. They did not give me back the 14 months of the Director of Operations timeline or the trust or the uncomplicated friendship. But they were true, and she said them without qualification. And I received them the way you receive a thing that is insufficient but honest, with recognition that insufficient honesty is still, in its way, a beginning. I left Patricia's house, and I sat in my car again. Different parking lot, same prayer posture. I said, Lord, now what? Now what turned out to be the most important question I had ever asked, because the answer that came to me, not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly, over the weeks that followed, the way dawn comes, was not what I expected. I expected the answer to be about Patricia, about justice, or accountability, or what the church was going to do about a process that had operated in the shadows. And some of it was about those things. Pastor Beaumont did have a direct and consequential conversation with Patricia and with the trustees who had participated in the subcommittee meeting. That conversation was handled within the leadership structure in ways that were not fully shared with me and were not mine to manage. But the larger answer, the one that changed my life, was about me. What I understood, sitting in those weeks of prayer and honest examination, was that I had built 15 years of my identity on a community that I had never fully claimed for myself. I had always been, at some level, a grateful guest in my own church life, careful not to take up too much space, performing the version of myself that I believed this community needed rather than the full version that God had made. I had given this church my best professional skills and my deepest loyalty and my most faithful service, and I had given them without ever fully understanding that giving is not the same as belonging, and that the distinction matters enormously when something goes wrong. The betrayal had not made me smaller, it had made me see, for the first time, how much space I had not been taking up. And I decided that the next chapter of my life was going to be different. I did not leave Mount Calvary. I want to say that clearly, because when I tell this story, people sometimes assume that the triumphant choice was to walk out, to start over somewhere else, to find a cleaner community and a fresh start. And I understand that impulse. I felt it in those early weeks, felt it sharply. But I had something my grandmother had passed down to me, something that Mama Eula had said to me when I was very young, in the particular way that old black church women pass down wisdom. She said, "Baby, you don't leave when it gets hard unless God tells you to leave. You stay and you grow and you make the thing better than it was when you found it. That is what we do." I stayed, and I grew, and I made some things better. But I stayed differently. The first thing I did, the very first practical step, in the month after the conversation with Patricia, was request a formal, written clarification from Pastor Beaumont about my role and my standing in the church's leadership structure. Not aggressively, not as an ultimatum, but as a professional act of self-protection, the kind that I had been performing for other people in healthcare administration for years, without ever thinking to perform it for myself in the community I called home. I asked for a written description of the role I already held, the co-chair of stewardship, with clarity about authority, responsibilities, and the scope of decisions that required my sign-off. I asked for the same for any expanded role going forward. I asked that the Director of Operations position, when created, be posted as a formal opportunity with a transparent process, open to internal and external candidates, with a structured interview committee that included voices from multiple ministries. Pastor Beaumont agreed to all of it. Without hesitation, he said, "Denise, I should have had these structures in place years ago. The fact that they weren't is part of what allowed this situation to develop. We are going to do this correctly." The Director of Operations position was posted 6 months later. I want to be honest about those 6 months because they were not easy months. I was still attending services alongside Patricia, who remained at Mount Calvary through that period. We were civil, we were professional, but the warmth was gone, replaced by a careful, mutual distance that everyone around us could feel, even if no one named it. I showed up every Sunday in that navy dress or something like it, and I did my work, and I prayed, and I held my head the way my grandmother taught me, which is all the way up. I applied for the position when it opened. So did Reverend Tate. So did 2 external candidates, a woman from a congregation in Raleigh and a man with nonprofit management experience who had no church affiliation. The interview committee was formed with representation from the trustees, the women's ministry, the deacon board, and one community member who was a nonprofit administrator from the neighborhood. I was interviewed on a Thursday afternoon by 5 people who asked me substantive, rigorous questions about organizational management, financial oversight, conflict resolution, and long-range ministry planning. I answered every question from 15 years of actual experience, and I did not soften a single answer to seem more palatable, and I did not inflate a single answer to seem more impressive. I was simply, completely, and entirely myself. I was selected. Reverend Tate received the news with a composure that I respected. She and I had a brief private conversation the week after the announcement. She sought me out, which required courage on her part, and I received her with the grace that the situation required. She told me she had allowed herself to be positioned in a way she was not fully comfortable with, and that she was sorry for her role in it. I told her that I did not hold her responsible for Patricia's decisions, and that my door as director of operations would always be open to her. We were not close after that, but we were decent to each other, which is its own kind of grace in a community where you share a pew every Sunday. Patricia Graves submitted her resignation from her ministries the month after my appointment was announced. She began attending a congregation across town shortly after. I heard this through Brenda, who heard it through the network of women who move information through Black church communities, the way water moves through channels, efficiently, thoroughly, and without announcement. I do not know what Patricia told herself about why she left. I do not spend time on that question anymore. I released it the same way you release things that are not yours to carry. Not with drama, not with ceremony, but with the quiet daily decision to set it down and keep walking. I want to tell you how it felt to receive that appointment, but I want to tell you honestly, which means I have to tell you that it did not feel the way I thought it would feel. I thought it would feel like vindication, like the universe righting itself, like justice arriving with a satisfying weight, and some of it was that. But more of it was quieter than that. More of it felt like, yes, of course. This was always going to be true, and now it is simply visible. The appointment did not create my qualifications. It revealed them. And the difference between those two things is something I needed the betrayal to teach me. The director of church operations role transformed not just my position at Mount Calvary, but my understanding of what I was capable of building. In the 3 years since my appointment, the things that have grown from that role are things that I could not have imagined in the parking lot at 11:30 at night, asking God whether I had anything left to give. I want to tell you some of them, because this is the part of the story that most needs to be told. The part that the pain was making space for. In the first year of my directorship, I created a formal financial literacy program for Mount Calvary's congregation. Not a budget workshop, not a generic curriculum in the fellowship hall. A real, structured, 12-week program developed in partnership with a Black-owned financial planning firm in Charlotte, covering everything from basic budgeting to homeownership to retirement planning to small business formation. The program was free to congregation members and their families, funded by a dedicated line in the ministry budget that I had built into my first annual plan. In the first year, 47 people enrolled. In the second year, 63. In the third year, we added a session specifically for young adults, and Imani, my daughter, my person, volunteered to co-facilitate it with a colleague from her social work network. The first year of the program, 2 families in our congregation were able to close on their first homes. A woman named Sister Carolyn, who was 58 years old and had never owned property, called me from the closing table to tell me. She was crying too hard to speak clearly, and I understood every word anyway. I also restructured the church's vendor contracts and renegotiated our primary banking relationship, resulting in a reduction in annual service fees. Those savings became the seed funding for a church-administered emergency assistance fund, a dedicated account governed by a 3-person committee with rotating membership for congregation members facing short-term financial crises. The fund was supplemented in its first year by a grant I wrote through a regional AME charitable foundation, which brought in an additional $20,000 in matching funds. Over 2 years, The fund distributed more than $40,000. Utility bills, medical copays, first and last month's rent for a woman and her children, leaving a dangerous situation. Small amounts, most of them. Life-changing amounts, all of them. In the second year of my directorship, our church was highlighted in a quarterly newsletter circulated by the AME District Conference, which profiled 3 congregations in the region for innovative stewardship practices. The district's director of finance administration, a woman who had been watching Mount Calvary's numbers improve in the annual reports, reached out to Pastor Beaumont and asked if I would be willing to present our model at the regional gathering. I drove to that conference with a folder of documentation and a presentation I had built from scratch, and I stood in front of 120 church leaders from 7 states, and I talked about what we had done at Mount Calvary and why it worked and what other congregations could adapt from it. After my presentation, a pastor from Greensboro pulled me aside and said he wanted to bring our model to his church and could I consult with his leadership team. Then a pastor from Columbia said the same thing. Then a woman who directed the AME Regional Women's Ministry asked if I would consider serving on their finance advisory board. I said yes to all of it. I tell you this not to catalog my accomplishments, but because I want you to understand something specific. Every single thing that grew in those years grew from the ground that the betrayal had cleared. The financial literacy program grew because the betrayal had taught me that institutions need formal structures to protect the people inside them, and that I was the person who knew how to build those structures. The Emergency Assistance Fund grew because the betrayal had taught me what it felt like to have your footing threatened when you were at your most vulnerable, and I was not willing to leave other people without a net. The regional work grew because the betrayal had finally forced me to stop operating as a guest in my own life and start operating as the leader that 15 years of faithful service had made me. Patricia Graves, in trying to make me smaller, had handed me the exact pressure I needed to become larger. I do not think she intended that, but God is not limited by other people's intentions. There is one more thing I need to tell you, and it is the hardest part. Harder than the working notes on the kitchen table, harder than the conversation on Patricia's doorstep, harder than the months of rebuilding. It is the thing that no one talks about when they tell triumph stories, because triumph stories are supposed to end with the arrival of the good thing. And what I'm about to tell you is what happened after the arrival. About 18 months into my directorship, I started having trouble sleeping. Not the troubled sleep of the betrayal period. That had been acute and had a clear cause. This was different. This was the sleeplessness of a woman who had everything she had worked for and was not sure why she still felt, in certain quiet moments, like she was waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was watching my back in ways that exhausted me. I was preparing for conversations in my head before they happened, building cases for decisions before anyone had questioned them, carrying a low-grade vigilance that I could not seem to set down. I had rebuilt the external structures of my professional and church life with exceptional care. I had not yet figured out how to rebuild the interior architecture, the part of me that had trusted without reservation, that had given without calculating, that had believed in community as an uncomplicated good. I went back to Sister Ruth. I told her what I had described to you just now. She listened in her usual way, with the stillness of a woman who is not formulating a response while you talk, but is simply receiving what you bring. When I finished, she said, "Denise, you have done the work of rebuilding everything that can be seen. You have not yet done the work of rebuilding what cannot." I said, "What does that work look like?" She said, "It looks like letting people into the parts of you that you started locking after Patricia." I sat with that for a long time, because she was right, and I knew she was right, and knowing she was right did not make it simple. The particular damage that institutional betrayal does, betrayal from people in spiritual authority, people you have trusted in the context of faith, is that it does not just hurt your feelings, it damages your theology. It makes you question whether community is actually safe, whether trust is actually wisdom, whether the vulnerability that faith requires is not, in fact, foolishness dressed in spiritual clothing. I had rebuilt my competence and my professional standing and my organizational contribution. but I had done it while keeping the walls around the personal part of me significantly higher than they had been before Patricia. The rebuilding of that, the interior work, was slower than the exterior work and less visible and more necessary. It looked like allowing a new friendship with a woman named Sister Joanna, who joined Mount Calvary in my second year as director, to develop into something real rather than keeping it at the careful distance of collegiality. It looked like telling Imani the full truth about what the betrayal had cost me emotionally, not just the narrative of triumph that was easier to offer. It looked like going to a therapist, a black woman named Dr. Anita Reeves, who specialized in spiritual trauma and faith community wounds, a specialty I had not known existed until Imani found her, and which turned out to be exactly the right expertise for the specific terrain I needed to cover. Dr. Reeves said something to me in our third session that I have carried like a smooth stone in my pocket ever since. Not heavy, but present. Something to touch when I need to remember. She said, "The goal is not to return to the trust you had before. The goal is to build a trust that is stronger because it has passed through fire. Naivety and wisdom are both forms of openness. What you are building now is the wiser kind." I worked with Dr. Reeves for 14 months. I want to say that plainly, because there is still a hesitation in some of our church communities around seeking professional support for emotional and spiritual pain. And I am a living witness that the work I did in that office was as holy as any work I did in prayer. God uses every instrument available to him. Dr. Reeves was one of his instruments in my life, and I will not minimize that by being silent about it. I am still building the wiser kind of trust. I want to be honest about that. Triumph is not a destination. It is a practice. Some days I practice it better than others, but I am still here. At Mount Calvary, in my director's office, in my home that I bought with my own hands, in the city where I drove with 2 suitcases and an 11-year-old, and a faith I was gripping with both hands in moving water. I am still here, and I am not gripping the faith anymore. I am held by it. That is not nothing. In fact, I think it might be everything. Last October, on the 15th anniversary of my membership at Mount Calvary, Pastor Beaumont, who has announced his retirement for the coming spring, asked me to say a few words at the anniversary service. I stood at that pulpit in a church that I had almost left. I looked out at a congregation that had witnessed more of my life than any other community of people alive. I saw Sister Ruth in the 4th row with her Bible open the way she always has it. I saw Imani 3 rows behind her, in the seat she sits in when she comes home for First Sunday. I saw Sister Joanna, my friend, who had no idea what it had cost me to let her be my friend. I saw Reverend Tate in the choir loft, doing the work she was always meant to do, the work that no subcommittee or appointment could take from her. I saw the faces of the families who had bought their first homes through the financial literacy program. I saw the woman whose utility bill the emergency fund had paid during the winter when she thought she was going to lose her lights. I saw the church that had hurt me, holding the fruit of the work I had done after the hurt. I said, 15 years ago I walked through those red doors holding my daughter's hand and asking God if he had brought me somewhere I could stay. I was not sure he had. I had been disappointed by communities before, and I expected to be disappointed again. What I did not know, what I could not have known, was that this place was going to ask of me something I did not know how to give. It was going to ask me to be betrayed and to stay, to be diminished and to rise, to find out that the people you love in faith communities are, like you, imperfect and broken, and capable of both remarkable faithfulness and remarkable failure, and that the question is not whether your community will fail you. It is what you will build in the space that failure makes. I paused. I looked at the red door at the back of the sanctuary. The stained glass light above it was doing what it always does, making the resurrection morning glow from inside. I said, I am still here, still building, still held. And then the choir began to sing, and I sat down, and I received the music the way I always receive music in that room. From the floor up, in my feet first, with the weight and the warmth of something that knows me and has always known me. and was never going to let me go. A reflection for the woman who is still in the middle of it. If you have been listening to this story and you are somewhere in the middle of it, somewhere between the folder on the kitchen table and the pulpit speech, I want to speak to you directly for a moment. I know what it is to sit in a parking lot in the dark, asking God whether you have anything left. I know what it is to be building something with your whole heart, and to discover that someone close to you has been quietly working against it. I know what it is to grieve a friendship and a community's image at the same time, to lose your uncomplicated love for a place you gave your best years to. And I want to tell you, the betrayal does not mean the work was wrong. It means the next chapter requires a different foundation, one that you could not have built without passing through what you are passing through. Romans 8:28 does not say that everything that happens to you is good. It says that God works all things, together for good for those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. The betrayal is in the all things. The person who moved against you is in the all things. The sleepless nights and the parking lot prayers and the notes on the kitchen table. All of it is in the hands of a God who is not surprised by any of it and who has been building the next version of you out of exactly these materials. You are not behind. You are not finished. You are being prepared. The community that needs you most is waiting on the other side of the thing that is trying to bury you. Do not let it bury you. You are too needed. Your gifts are too real. Your story is too important. Stay, pray, build, and watch what God does with the space that the betrayal made. If this story spoke to something you are carrying right now, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below. Tell me where you are in your story. Tell me what you are building. Tell me what you are believing God for, even when the believing is hard. This community is for you. If Denise's story moved you, please like this video. It helps more women find it who need to hear it. Subscribe to Sister Circle Stories, because every week we gather here to tell the truth about faith and failure and the remarkable things that grow when women who belong to God decide they are not going to be buried by what was meant to destroy them. We are here. We are not going anywhere, and neither are you.